Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
Message from our sponsor, Vitsu. Marta's story.
If only each shelf could talk, reflected Marta, a Vitsu customer since 2004. Her shelving system began modestly and has grown over the years. It travelled with her from London to Valencia and now Amsterdam. This is the fifth time Marta has bought from Vitsu. Every time, she speaks with her personal Vitsu planner, Robin, who reorganised her bookshelves to fit her Spanish walls and her Dutch house. He even sent her extra packaging to protect her shelves with each move. You might say that their relationship has become a friendship over the years. Marta knows she is valued and trusts the advice Robin gives.
If your shelves could talk, what would they say? Vitsu's 606 Universal Shelving System is a modular, adaptable kit of parts. It can form the perfect home for your books and even the desk from which to write one. Visit vitsu.com, vitsoe.com, or request a free brochure via email at vitsu.com by quoting ATN 606.
Vitsu, makers of long-living furniture by Dieter Rams. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and I spoke with the journalist and author Maggie Fergusson.
We spoke to Maggie about her work both past and present at the Royal Society of Literature, about her biographies of George Mackay Brown and Michael Morpurgo, and about her work as a journalist.
It's a fascinating episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Maggie, to Always Take Notes. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Can we start with your work at the Royal Society of Literature, where you are the literary advisor? For those who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about what the RSL does? You've described it as among the strangest and most beguiling organisations in London.
Yes, I'm not sure it still would merit that description. I'm sure it's very beguiling, but it's no longer very strange. But when I first worked there in the early 1990s, it was in a large house in Bayswater, which had its own lecture hall, massive offices upstairs, and I was this sole employee. So I had an office the size of a tennis court and a library next to my office of all the fellows of the Royal Society of Literature's books. But nobody was allowed to use the library because a fellow some years before I joined had taken to turning up at the RSL in 2 pairs of trousers sewn together at the hems, and he would drop books down into his trousers and then walk off with them. And then eventually it was discovered that these books were being stolen and the library was closed. So it was like a kind of Sleeping Beauty room, these dusty old books that nobody but me looked at or touched. We had John Mortimer was then our chairman, and Roy Jenkins was our president, and the fellowship of the RSL was quite elderly and rather very sort of white and grand. Anyway, it grew and it changed, and now the new president of the RSL is Bernardine Evaristo, just elected, and full of ideas about how to yank the RSL into the, well, first it has to come into the 20th century and then into the 21st. So it's now a sort of busy, zinging organisation, that has nothing to do with me, but it's very well run by somebody called Molly Rosenberg and her very excellent team. And I simply these days edit their magazine. Yeah, so that's but this is like my connection with the RSL goes back 30 odd years. So it's a long thing.
And following from you alluding to its various changes, what is the history of the organisation and how has it evolved over the years?
Yes, well, it was founded by George IV in 1820, and in those days literature wasn't really so much to do with sort of novels and biographies and poetry. It was to do with kind of antiquarian researches. So the early fellows were mainly antiquarians, and then slowly at the beginning of the 20th century it began to change literature began to be understood in the way we would understand it now. And so there was a fellowship of sort of grand elected writers and a membership of people interested in literature, and they would run a programme of events, and some pretty amazing people kind of passed through the lecture hall of the RSL, especially in my early days, actually, sort of Muriel Spark, Seamus Heaney, a lot of quite extraordinary writers kind of came into my life in a way in those early days. So I was very, very lucky in that. But today they do far more. I mean, they don't just run programs of events. They do, they've got a new scheme for mentoring black writers, matching them up with black writer mentors. They're doing, work to encourage reading in schools. They're encouraging the writing of poetry during lockdown, that kind of thing. So it's a busy and kind of worthy organisation in a way that I think maybe it wasn't when I was in charge of it. But it's growing very nicely.
I believe you joined in the autumn of 1991 as a secretary, which you alluded to, and then you've been director as well. Could you talk us through the various roles you've had there and what they've involved? Yeah,
well, actually, being the secretary and being the director were actually the same thing. It was just at a certain point, people began to think that the title secretary, which in an old-fashioned way is actually quite grand, but that sort of younger people didn't recognise it as such. So secretary sounded like I was kind of administrative dog's body. So they changed my name from secretary to director. But what was I in charge of? I mean, I was simply in charge of kind of running the things. So running the council meetings as a sort of council of writers who run the RSL. So I would be in charge of their meetings, in charge of setting up the lecture programs, and and everything down to doing the accounts. And because as I said in the beginning, it was only me on the staff, so I was doing literally everything. And I mean, that meant in the early days when I was first there, we didn't even have a computer. So I was working on a manual typewriter. I don't really understand, looking back, how on earth that was possible. Every letter had to go out, having been, bashed out on a manual typewriter. We didn't even have a photocopying machine. They had just before I arrived bought an answering machine for the phone, but that was thought to be very, outlandishly modern, and no one had ever thought of having such a thing. While I was there in the early days, they acquired a fridge. Actually, John Mortimer bought the RSL a fridge because he said he couldn't stand drinking warm white wine at our AGMs and things. But that was all that kind of thing. So I was, everything from going to buy the fridge in Edgware Road to taking Muriel Spark out to dinner. It was very varied.
And what does your role there now involve, and how much of your time is taken up with RSL activities?
Well, my role there now really is just they bring out once a year something called the Royal Society of Literature Review, which is basically their magazine, and I edit that. And so we've just sent it to the printer for this year, but for sort of 2 months before that, it's very, very hard work. There's a magazine that covers all that the RSL's been doing, and the prizes that have been awarded, and the new presidents having been elected and that kind of thing, but also features and notes about all the new fellows. And it's quite a kind of hefty piece of work, but fun. Yeah.
Could we track back now to your childhood? Was it a particularly bookish childhood? I read somewhere that you loved the Ladybird People at Work series when you were young.
Yeah, I did. I loved all the Ladybird books, actually, very much. Yes, it was a bookish childhood. My parents had met at Oxford. My mum read history, as I did later, but my dad read English, and his tutor was C.S. Lewis at Magdalen. So we were read to a huge amount as small children. There are 5 of us children, and I went to a school that was a bit sort of dim academically, but literature was something they did mind about. You know, they read to us while we, I'm not joking, while we darned our socks on a Wednesday evening, that kind of thing. So yes, I think books have always been a big thing.
So then following up from that, why did you choose to study history over, say, English at university?
I mean, it was a toss-up between the two. It could have gone either way. I think that, well, what happened was that as I said, my school was not very academic, and the history teaching at A-level was particularly weak. And so my mum, who was very sort of beady about these things, decided I should just stop having history lessons at school, and she found a tutor at Eton who would take me on. He was actually the head of history at Eton, who took me on for a year by myself, and his teaching was so inspirationally good that I really, by the end of that year, I wanted to do history. And then I had another term at Eton with Boris, and yeah, by then I decided to do history. Yeah.
Was he a particularly good classmate, or or not?
He wasn't. Well, he was a classicist, so he wasn't in the same actual classes as me. But he was already this kind of enormous figure. Everybody knew about Boris. Everybody knew he was. It was completely obvious he was going to, that was going to grow, and, everybody in the country would know he was at some point. So it's very odd, yeah.
And then after university, is it right that you went to work in the city initially? Why did you end up going in that direction?
So, I mean, that was a terrible mistake, but my parents, it was absolutely clear that I had to get some sort of job that would keep me. I mean, my parents weren't living in London, so I couldn't just sort of hang around at home and wait to get a job in publishing or something. I had to get a job lined up. I was rather fed up with having no money, and so I went in on the milk round. And in those days, I don't know, maybe it's the same still, I'm not sure, but in those days it was very, very easy to get a job in the city. The bankers came pouring down to Oxford. They took over bedrooms in the Randolph Hotel. You sat in these interviews on sort of twin beds with your knees knocking against a banker's knees, and they had these interviews, and all they asked me about was the fact that I'd been at Eton. That was the question. That I just kept answering this question. They never asked me about, whether I thought that the share price of Tarmac was going up or down. It was nothing like that at all. So, I got this job without much problem. But as soon as I arrived to start work, it was clear to me it wasn't. I simply couldn't possibly carry on there very long.
And so how did you make your first steps in journalism? I read an interview where you described a sort of disastrous typing course on the Strand.
Oh, yes, awful, God. So after the city came to a sort of disastrous end because I was engaged to somebody who was in the same firm, and then I pulled out of the engagement at slightly the last minute, so I had to leave the job. I lost my flat, which I bought with a sort of 0% mortgage rate, so I didn't have the boyfriend, I didn't have the job, I didn't have any money, and I was pretty kind of at a pretty low ebb. So I went to do a typing course in Charing Cross Road, and it was quite miserable, and I had no idea where it was going to lead. But then when I was a few weeks into it, a friend rang and said she was working on Harper's and Queen, which doesn't really exist anymore, I don't think. It's now called Harper's Bazaar, and they were looking for a sub-editor, and they weren't advertising the job at all. I mean, these days, hundreds of people would be trying for a job like that, but I think only 3 of us were interviewed, and so I got that job, and that was the beginning. And we had we used to have a restaurant column, the subs, and we would go out and review restaurants. So it was possible to get a tiny, tiny, tiny toe in the door of writing, and that went quite well. And then I started to write features for them. And then there was this, I don't know if it still exists, you may know, there was this wonderful prize called the Catherine Pakenham Award for a woman journalist, and a woman journalist under 25, I think. And I was twice runner-up for that, and that got me work, because I was then able to say to people, I've been twice runner-up, could I do this or that? And I was sort of asking all my friends to try and have thoughts about people I might interview or pieces I might write, and it just started. Things started moving, and I did some very dull writing just to sort of keep the money coming in, but some of it was really thrilling and even life-changing. And I mean, when I say that, I mean I'm looking back at my being sent up to Orkney to interview George Mackay-Brown, because that was a thing that changed my life. And I was still, I don't know, I was about 25 or something, I think. There used to be a wonderful Saturday review on the Times, and they ran big features. You could write 5,000 words. And they sent me first to interview Kathleen Raine, the poet, and then George Mackay-Brown. Yeah.
We wanted to come back to George Mackay-Brown in more detail later on, but could you explain a bit about what the kind of culture and the environment of magazines and newspapers when you were starting out, this was in the 80s, I think, compared to today? How were things different to today?
I mean, Harper's and Queen, I've no idea what it would be like these days on a glossy magazine, because I haven't worked on one for years and years. In those days, on Harper's and Queen, I was very grateful to have that job, very grateful for some of the people I worked with, but it wasn't really my kind of place at all. So it was, it was very glossy, very much to do with fashion and parties, and I remember the whole atmosphere in the office. It used to always feel to me like a bit like a cocktail party going at kind of not quite full speed. And so, I mean, I was lucky to be there, but I was lucky to move on as well. Newspapers, I mean, I think the funny thing is that way back in those days, this is way before email, so there was no way of emailing an editor saying, would you think of allowing me to do this or that? You had to literally get your cuttings out, photocopy them, put them into parcels, write a covering letter on, in my case, a manual typewriter for quite a long time. Weirdly, I think that it was easier to get work like that than it is now, because I think that editors get emails just sort of flooding their inboxes, and emails from totally unknown writers are quite unlikely, unless the editor is particularly kind. I think that it's very easy for those emails just to get lost. So I think strangely, and I think it was easier for me then than it would be now.
When you moved on from Harper's and Queen, were you freelancing, or did you have other kind of staff roles at other publications?
Oh, well, when I moved on from Harper's and Queen, I was at the Royal Society of Literature, and that was always part-time. So I did 2 days a week there, and then I was freelancing 3 days a week. And I have to say, I think that is, I would say to anyone trying to get into journalism, if you can possibly get a part-time job that you can rely on the income from, and then freelance the rest of the time, that's ideal, because to freelance 100% I think is really difficult. In fact, well, I've never managed to do it. I don't think I would be able to do it.
So we always, on the podcast, we always ask about money and how it has interfaced with people's writing lives. So at that time in say the 90s, the amount that publications paid for freelance pieces, and I know taking inflation into account and so forth, how did it compare to how rates are now? Was there more money around?
Yeah, there was more money around. I mean, honestly, what I remember being paid by various publications in those days was not very much less than what you would be paid now. And that's 25 years ago. So I think I think the money is much harder now, much harder. Yeah.
Could we now talk about the assignment that you mentioned for the Times in 1992 that led to your first book? You mentioned specifically a disastrous first interview. Could you tell listeners a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So I had begun to read George Mackay Brown's poetry actually in that strange closed library of the Royal Society of Literature. I took it down off the shelf and I was just bowled over by his poetry. Absolutely marvellous kind of images, like, lovers lying under the buttered bannock of the moon, and it was just I thought it was fantastic. So and I heard he had a novel coming out, and I asked the woman whose name I can't remember at the Times whether I could go and interview him, and so she said yes, and off I went, and I arrived in Orkney. It was the end of May, so it was very, very beautiful weather. Orkney hardly gets dark at that time of year, and the light is just kind of spilling out over the islands. And I couldn't wait to meet George Mackay Brown, but when I turned up at his council flat the next day, I realised he was paralytically shy, and all the questions I'd been prepared to ask him, he answered in sort of monosyllables or not at all. And then he leaned back he was sitting in a rocking chair and leaned his head on his hands and just began to hum. And I thought, oh my God, this is really disastrous. But it happened that I met him the following day at Mass in the Catholic chapel outside Orkney, and he asked, it was a tiny congregation, about 5 of us, and he asked us all to go back for tea. And then he was sort of transformed. He was relaxed and very witty, very brilliant mimic, very sweet host, and we had this jolly time. And then I said, I think, it's time for me to go. And he said, oh, can I just show you something? And I said, sure. And he got a facsimile he'd been sent by a friend in Edinburgh of a letter that Mary, Queen of Scots, had written to her grandfather the day before, her cousin, the King of France, the night before she died. And it was all in sort of medieval French. And I said to him, I'm afraid I can't understand this. And he said, no, what I want you to take on board is the firmness of her script in the face of death. And I just felt that was kind of like he was, it was an invitation to friendship. And indeed he became a great, great friend for the next 4 years until he died in 96.
So I've been a couple of times to Orkney and likewise have found a really beguiling place. I've got a friend who lives in Stromness, but I'm conscious that some of our listeners may not know that much about Orkney and sort of where it fits into Scottish culture and stuff. Could you give a bit of an explainer about just what kind of place it is and where George Mackay Brown kind of fitted into its tradition and its culture?
Of course, yes. That's really, really nice that you've been there. So what I sometimes say to people if I'm trying to explain where Orkney is that if you drive north and you get as far as Edinburgh, you're only halfway. So it's that much further north to get from Edinburgh up to Orkney. And the landscape is, so if you were doing it by car, when you get to the north of Scotland, to sort of Strathy, it's very craggy and wild. And slightly forbidding, but you cross that little bit of water to Orkney, and it's a beautifully kind of fertile, green set of 70 islands. And I think the best way to describe the shape of them is that they're not mountainous, except for one of them called Foy, but nor are they flat, and they are what the poet Edwin Muir used to describe as fluent, and I think that's by far the best way to describe the sort of shape of the landscape. So there are very few trees because there's so much wind, but almost everywhere you look, you can see the sea, and you can see right over to the horizon, and you can see the sort of curve of the horizon. So it's clear, you can see that you're on a globe. And then everywhere you go, there's history going way back to kind of prehistoric history, right through Viking history. There's the most amazing cathedral in Kirkwall, the capital, built by the Durham Masons in the 12th century, and then right up to the remains from the First World War and the Second World War, because Orkney is, for anyone who doesn't know, Orkney is where Scapa Flow is. So that's where the great kind of naval manoeuvres of the First and Second World War happened. So you feel this huge arc of history, and it always gives me the feeling that life is very short, because we're tight, very insignificant in this enormous kind of sweep of time. Very short, but very precious. And that's quite a difficult thing to feel in London. I think it's much easier up there.
And so how did your relationship with Brown develop over the ensuing years? And at what point did the idea of a biography emerge?
So I came back to London, having done that first interview, and I was so bowled over by the place, the poetry, and the man, that I just kept my curtains closed for the whole of the first morning back. I couldn't bear to look out of the window. I just wanted to make sure that everything kind of stayed in my head. And I didn't know how it would develop. And then a couple of days after that, a letter arrived from George Mackay Brown, in which, amongst other bits of news and stuff, he said, I hope you will come back often. I feel you belong here in Orkney. And I was really amazed by that. I felt I belonged in Orkney from the moment I arrived there, but that he should have felt it seemed amazing to me. So I did go back as much as I possibly could, and it became almost like a second home. And I found things to write about, so things to write freelance articles about, like, I interviewed Peter Maxwell Davies on his 60th birthday, and I went to write about a little school on one of the tiny islands where there are only 2 pupils, and I did more writing about George Mackay Brown. So I was constantly going back there with a purpose, and sort of just about managing to kind of pay my way to be there. And then in the summer of 1995, George's editor, who's called Hugo Brunner, said to me, what would you ever think about writing his life? And I said I would, I can't think of anything I'd rather do, but I just wouldn't ever dare ask him. So Hugo Brunner talked to George, said to me, he's happy for you to do it. So I went to George's house that afternoon. I never, ever dared say to him, Hugo says, you're happy for me to do this. We never actually talked about the book, but because he was, he was very, very shy, and I was quite shy. But he said, shall we go for a walk? We went for a little walk. We sat on a bench in Stromness, looking out over the sea, and he just started talking about his childhood, and he talked and talked and talked for, I don't know, over an hour. And at the end of that conversation, I thought, he wants, he's giving me his blessing to do it. Yeah.
And that was a year before he died. Is that right? He died in 96. Okay. And so how did the process of writing the book span these two sides of when he was still alive and then when after he died? Did it move to become an archival thing?
It was always agreed that I wouldn't write anything until after he died. So, and we had arranged that in the month of May 1996, I was going to spend a month in Orkney, and I was going to see him every evening, and we would talk about his life. So that was the plan. There was no reason to think he was going to die. And then in April, he died very suddenly. So I hadn't really done much work, and I wasn't going to be able to talk to him about it. So I was a bit I did wonder. I mean, part of me thought, somebody really, really needs to tell his story. And part of me thought, I just don't see how this is going to be done, because, he didn't travel, he didn't ever sign one of his book, he didn't do a book signing, he didn't do a public reading. There was, on the face of it, there was very, very little to say. But then, so I went up to Edinburgh in that month of May when I would have been in Orkney, and began to look through his manuscripts in the Edinburgh University Library. And then the librarian came over one day to my desk, and he said, I think, I have something you might be interested in. And he showed me a box, and it had a rather cryptic message on the outside in George's handwriting, saying something like, not to be read for the time being. And anyway, the librarian agreed to open it, and out tumbled about 250 letters from George Mackay-Brown to his great muse, Stella Cartwright. And those letters are so extraordinary that I thought, even if I could only tell that part of his story, it has to be done. So that was what sort of kicked it off.
How much time did you spend in archives in total while you were working on the book? I counted at least 13 different libraries or institutions in your acknowledgements.
Yes, I spent a lot of... it's difficult, because as soon as... I got married almost immediately after George died, and then I had children, and I was also working at the RSL. So the book was a very sort of stop-start thing, and it took a long, long time. So, yes, I spent a lot of time in archives, but I really loved it. I mean, it's such a lovely thing to do. I mean, the Stella Cartwright letters obviously were particularly special, and then I discovered all her letters back to George, and it was just the most beautiful, poignant, sad kind of relationship that was revealed through them. But then even things like the Publishers' Archives, which were in Reading University Library, so it's a sort of grotty little low-ceilinged room, but just to read through those boxes of letters and see how George Mackay-Brown was sort of introduced by Edwin Muir to the Hogarth Press, which later became Chatto, and how one particular editor called Nora Smallwood brought him on, very, very slowly over the years, getting him to do more and more and persuading him to write a memoir and this kind of thing. It was absolutely, to me, it was absolutely fascinating. You dive into one of those archive boxes and you're back, 30 years or something, and more than that actually, and just following people almost sort of day by day through their lives is wonderful.
Is it right that he had, I think as you alluded to just now, he'd published a memoir or an autobiography just before he died, and then there was also a literary biography that came out before yours, is that right? How did you kind of use those as material, or where did those other works fit with your project?
So he wrote, what happened was that when Stella Cartwright, whom he loved so much, died in very sad circumstances, she was an alcoholic, in 1985, he, for the first time in his life, suffered from writer's block. He could not write anything, and he also suffered terribly from depression, George. So he was in a bad way, and in order to lift himself out of that, he began writing his autobiography For the Islands I Sing. And it's a sort of slightly strange book because it's not very long. He dwells on the things that he wants to dwell on. He writes very beautifully in the middle of it about Stella. He writes a lot about Orkney. He writes a lot about his faith, but it's not really conventional, doesn't really exactly take you through his life. Anyway, he gave me the manuscript of that while he was still alive, and it wasn't published, I think, for a couple of years after he died. So that was fine. There was no problem. I wasn't, there was another book to be written. I mean, it wasn't that there was no more to be said. So that was fine. And the literary biography was written by some friends of his in Orkney, and it's just a totally different thing from my book. It's a piece of sort of serious lit crit, which is not I would never be able to write, and it's not what I did write. So there was room for all three books. Yeah.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the author and journalist Maggie Fergusson. You're about to hear the next instalment of our new segment. In this segment, you'll hear previous guests of the show answer one of three questions. What's a piece of advice you wish you'd had at the start of your career? When is a time you failed? And what's the most important trait someone in your profession can have? Their answers weren't included in the main interviews that Simon and Rachel did with them, so hopefully they give you some fresh insight into the careers of some of the fascinating guests we've had on. So, without further ado, here's the novelist Val McDermid with the most important trait a writer should have.
And I think the one trait that I think any successful writer needs to possess is patience. Sometimes it takes a very long time to figure out how to tell a story. I always think that the point where you're ready to write a novel is when you understand what the structure of the story is that you're trying to tell. And that doesn't always come in a hurry. Sometimes you have a great idea for a story and things fall into place very quickly. But other times you've got the story and you can't figure out how to tell it. I think my record between actually knowing what the story was and finding the structure for it was 12 years. I had a brilliant idea for a thriller and many of the elements fell into place, but there was one narrative element I couldn't figure out how to fit into the story. And I wrote the first 15,000 words of that book 5 times and tore it up every time because I just couldn't figure out the structure. And when the answer came, it didn't come from me being brilliant and figuring out some spectacular way of doing it. It came about because something in the outside world changed. I struggled with the book because there was a character whose backstory she had carefully obliterated over the years, but I had to find a reason why she would open up about that again. And what gave me the opportunity, what made sense of all of that, was when misery memoirs started to become so popular. And I suddenly realised that she's the kind of person who would have the misery memoir. And that opened that up for me. It opened up that possibility of why she would start talking about her past again. And that suddenly was like the light bulb going on in my head. I knew how to write the novel.
That was Val McDermid. Now back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Maggie Fergusson.
We tend to get into the nuts and bolts of writing on this podcast. And I think I read that your research was supported by grants in part. Where did those grants come from and how did you go about applying for them and all of that stuff?
I think I got 2 grants. One was from the Society of Authors, where I think it's called the Catherine Blundell Trust. And I was put in touch with that by Michael Holroyd, who by that time was chair of the Royal Society of Literature. So I was lucky. I mean, otherwise I really might not have known about it. But the Society of Authors does give amazing grants for writers. If anyone hears this and is looking for a grant, it's definitely worth looking up. And then I got one from my old college, Somerville. I I can't for the life of me remember how much they were worth, but the Somerville one I put towards. I literally bought sort of parcels of childcare so that when the children were tiny, I could just have 3 hours here and there to write. I think those were the only two, and I had a sort of tiny advance, what Michael Holroyd would call more a retreat than an advance, but it was, minute.
And what was the connection between doing the Mackay Brown biography and then the later one on Michael Morpurgo? How did those two projects kind of lean to one another?
Well, there's not really much of a connection, except that Michael Morpurgo read the George Mackay Brown book and then got in touch out of the blue and said, would you like to write something about me? And I was a little bit wary. Such a very different subject. He's an incredibly nice man, Michael Morpurgo. Very, very nice. I'm very fond of him. But it was a completely different sort of story. And also, it is very different to write about somebody who's still alive. And I think really I would suggest that anyone who's thinking about writing about somebody who's still alive kind of thinks again, because of course you have the advantage that your subject is there to answer questions and tell you everything that's happened, but with the best will in the world, if people are still alive, they really don't want you to tell a kind of warts and all story. You just can't, and so you end up writing something a bit bland. That's what I felt.
Was that the fact that Michael Morpurgo is still alive? Was that part of the reason that the format of the book is slightly more unusual, with the kind of interstitial stories?
With the best will in the world, if people are still alive, they really don't want you to tell a kind of warts and all story. You just can't, and so you end up writing something a bit bland. That's what I felt. Yeah.
Was that the fact that Michael Morpurgo is still alive? Was that part of the reason that the format of the book is slightly more unusual?
Yes.
Kind of
well, also yes,
stories?
Yes. I think. Well, the idea was that it might be possible to create a book that was appealing both to children and to adults, so that if I wrote the biographical chapters, which would the adults might read, the children might read the stories in between. But I'm not convinced that really happened.
Without diverging any confidences, you able to say what any of the kind of points of tension with your living subject were with that book?
With Michael, I mean, I think he wouldn't mind me. I don't think he would mind me saying that he had at that time, and I think it's now mercifully much better. But there were tensions between him and his own children, and there was no way Michael or even more his wife Claire were going to let me write about that, and certainly the children weren't going to, completely understandably. So that was really it.
Could we move on to talk about your work at Intelligent Life, where you became literary editor? When did you start working there, and what was your sort of day-to-day routine like, given that it's was a quarterly publication?
Yes. The awful thing is I really don't know what year I started working there, but was it maybe 2010, 2011, 12, that kind of thing. And it was just because the editor, Tim Delisle, was a friend. We were at Oxford together, although he's slightly older than me. And somehow we sort of chatted about books and things, and he just took it into his head that there wasn't a literary editor before I came, I don't think, and he wanted to do a bit more with books, and he thought it would be good, and I think it was good actually. I hope other people thought so too, to have, rather than have somebody who just commissioned reviews, to have somebody who actually wrote brief reviews of. It started off being 8 books per issue, and then it went down to 6, and it was just called 6 Good Books. So it was a lot of reading, but that was, that's a pretty nice job. I came into the office maybe a couple of days a week, and then and it was a lovely, really nice staff, really lovely people to be working with, and one of the fantastic things was that Intelligent Life it was so sort of lavishly funded that it was possible to get writers, really grand writers, to write pieces that otherwise they simply wouldn't have done. So I began commissioning features as well as doing the books, and there's some pieces I just loved working on, like a piece about Patrick McGrath, the novelist who grew up in Broadmoor. His father was the chief medical superintendent of Broadmoor, so he grew up with all these sort of criminal lunatics, as his best friends, pushing his swing and making his sandpit. And I just found that absolutely, completely fascinating. And then I started commissioning this series called Authors on Museums, where we invited authors, and they've really because we were able to pay them £1 a word, I think, to do this, and to fly them plus a partner to whatever museum they wanted anywhere in the world, and to stay there for a couple of nights. It was just extraordinary. I remember when I sent an invitation to Alice Oswald, the poet, to do this, she got back and said, could I just hammer this out? Are you really suggesting that you're going to send me all this way and you're going to pay me £1 a word because I've just read it out to my children and they think it's a joke? So we did that, and God, there were some wonderful, fantastic pieces. I think, the ones that I remember most clearly and fondly are Roddy Doyle's wonderful piece on the Tenement Museum in New York, and Frank Cottrell Boyce on the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Those two are amazing bits of writing, very, very thrilling to be able to work on them.
I was looking in the version of those that became a book and seeing Tim Delisle's comments about how he was inspired for this by how different museums were visiting with his child. But I was particularly struck in terms of the work that you mentioned. I know this is from a slightly later iteration of the publication, but the piece about loneliness that you wrote for 1843, which I found very moving. What was the kind of inspiration for doing that? And tell us a bit about the process of reporting and writing that story.
I think, I'm hoping I'm getting this right, but I think that before writing about loneliness, I wrote a piece about dying. And the piece about dying was commissioned by Tim. Said in the office one day, I think we should do a piece about dying. There was suddenly something in the kind of zeitgeist. Everybody was writing about dying. And since then have been masses of books about death and dying. And I said, I just jumped at it. I just said, please, can I do that? And he said, okay, you do it. And I did. I found it absolutely fascinating, and I love it's almost better than writing a book, which is always long drawn out and rather stressful, to have a piece of long form journalism that you can just bury yourself in for a month or something and then have this long piece and then leave it behind, I think is great. But the piece about dying seemed to hit a chord. I don't know, it seemed to go down well. And then I think that it was Emma Duncan who suggested this piece on that we must do something about loneliness. And because I was in a sort of, in everybody's good books after the piece on dying, I was then able to say, please, can I do the piece on loneliness? And I was given it. So, yeah, fascinating, very fascinating.
How long did it take to report, write, and then I guess edit as well?
I don't remember loneliness being too difficult. I would think it might have been all in all stretched over a couple of months. The one that really, really I found difficult, and in the end they brought in more help with, was a piece about gifted children. For some reason I just could not get quite what they were kind of asking me to do. So that was much more difficult. But I think that the dying piece and the loneliness piece were very smooth.
Why was the gifted children piece more complicated? As Ray just said, we love to talk about the kind of how an edit process works and how things get developed. What was trickier with that process?
I just found it very difficult to get a handle on. First of all, you have to work out exactly what it means to be a gifted child, and of course there are masses of parents who think they've got gifted children and who probably haven't. Then I sort of tracked down various gifted children who'd done incredibly well on, I can't remember what that programme was on television about the child genius or something. But then it was thought that wasn't exactly what was wanted. I don't know. It just seemed, it seemed to go sort of backwards. And then they wanted me to speak to a neuroscientist who specialised in gifts, and I spoke to one, but it didn't seem to be quite what was wanted, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so Simon Willis then came in and did some research, and it's kind of really basically the piece is by both of us, because it wasn't entirely my piece, but I sometimes, if I click on it in my documents, the gifted children thing, I mean, it's got almost more files in it than all my research over 10 years on George Mackay Brown. It's just incredible amount of work and slightly frustrating, but yeah.
Well, George Mackay Brown also pops up in another piece you sent us about prison reading groups. Where did the idea for that one come from?
The prison reading groups piece. I was kind of looking around for something I might do when my children were sort of older and they didn't, I wasn't so much kind of needed at the school gates and that kind of thing. I wanted to do something. I wasn't sure what, some kind of voluntary work, and somebody put me in touch with prison reading groups, and I put my name down as a volunteer, and then I didn't hear anything for a couple of years, and then I got an email saying, "Are you still interested? There's a group in Wandsworth Prison. If you'd like to take it on," and so I said, "Yeah," and rather amazingly, there's no training. There's no security checks. I mean, this is high security prison, and in the wing called the Vulnerable Prisoners Unit, so it's a very high security wing. But you just go in there. They don't tell you how to, what you should do if you get alarmed or anything. Anyway, I'm glad to say that's never happened. So I started taking this group. We meet once a month. We are each given a copy of a book which the group themselves choose. We read it and we get together for an hour or so and just chat about the book, and then maybe read a bit of poetry or a short story at the end. And it is, I was there this week. It is amazing to me every time how these prisoners who are, one of the guys in our group this week who'd been on remand has just been sentenced to 20 years. But with the right book and the kind of right guidance, these men are lifted out of their gloom. They really are, for an hour, and they're fantastic. It's great. It's a great scheme that was set up by somebody called Sarah Turvey about 20 years ago. So I feel very, very lucky to be part of that.
So we're coming towards the end of our time now, but could you tell us a bit about your work at the Tablet now as literary editor, and how that works, and what is working at a faith-based publication like compared to your experiences elsewhere?
Well, I love my job at the Tablet. So it couldn't be more different from Intelligent Life, where we were able to pay people £1 a word to do authors on museums pieces. The Tablet pays, I can't remember, sort of 2p a word or something. So it's a very different challenge trying to get people to write for me. But there are actually plenty of people who are prepared to do so. And I'm the literary editor. I'm commissioning book reviews, but also, as at Intelligent Life, I'm also interviewing people and working on features and stuff. And on the whole, they nod towards the kind of religious, whilst also being interesting to everybody. So I'm just thinking of people I've interviewed this year. So Gwen Adshead, I can't remember the name of her book that came out in the autumn. She's the one who was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist at Broadmoor all her life, and it's a book about dealing with these men who've done these terrible things, and it's a book exploring whether there is such a thing as evil or not. Well, that's very fascinating to me, but I think it's not just because I'm a Catholic. That is a fascinating question. Frank Cottrell Boyce I interviewed for the Christmas issue, so he's a very, very devout Catholic, and he talked a lot about his faith, but he also does amazing work in schools in Liverpool, prisons, with the homeless. His wife does incredible work with refugee women. So that to me was very interesting. So that's sort of half religious and half general readership. And those are the kinds of things that interest me.
How many pieces a week do you sort of oversee and shepherd through to publication?
On the tablet, there are 5 reviews a week. So it's tiny, 3 pages of reviews a week. But it's not a full-time job. It's 2 days a week. Yeah.
And kind of alluding to that portfolio way that you've managed your career, how does your sort of mix of different roles and jobs work at the moment? And then over the 3 decades or so you've been doing this, how has it all fitted together financially? You alluded earlier to it was sort of early important when you were starting out to have this couple of regular days a week and then other stuff around that. How has that jigsaw kind of developed and varied over the years?
I mean, I've never made loads of money, but I've never been desperately worried about money either. It's funny, we were talking at lunch about how some of our friends, certainly the people I knew in the city, made absolutely squillions of pounds, and you would think that it was just impossible to have a sort of decent life on a journalist's salary. I mean, what you earn, 30, 40, 50 maximum, that kind of thing. But actually, you do. So it's not. We were very lucky that we were living in West London. We were surrounded by the most outstanding Catholic state schools, so our children went through those. So there's no question of having to raise school fees. But yeah, I mean, it's fine. I can't think of anything. I suppose some people really, really want to have a second house, and I can't think of anything I would less like to have than a second house. I would just spend my time on the motorway worrying that I'd left, the brie in the fridge in the other house and that kind of thing. I just couldn't bear it. So I'm very happy not to be very rich.
And as a final question for me, is there anything that any kind of passion projects that you would like to write if you had the opportunity to? I can't say there is at the moment, but they come up every time I do a piece. Like the most recent one is Frank Cottrell Boyce, as I said, and before that I interviewed the Canet Mason family. There's amazing 7 musicians, and every single time I get one of those pieces, I think, God, this is the best piece I could ever. There's nothing I would rather write than this, and there's never going to be such a good one again. And the thing is, there just are. So I just know there will be things coming up in the new year that I get kind of not just interested in, I get kind of borderline obsessed by, and then bury myself in them for a couple of weeks and then come out the other side. So yeah, not at the moment, but there will be.
Brilliant, Maggie. Well, look, thank you for being a fascinating guest on Always Take Notes and telling us all about your various projects, and also for that wonderful little portrait of Orkney that you gave.
Oh, where did you go in Orkney?
So I have a friend of mine from university lives in Stromness, so I've been up to see her, and then another friend of mine, his family have like a tiny place up in the sort of on mainland, but kind of on the north coast of there. So I've been once in the middle of winter, and then once in the height of summer, and just found the light remarkable and wonderful. I do remember getting the ferry from Aberdeen in like a force 9 gale, and that was quite grim, but no, it's a wonderful place. But yeah, wishing you all the best, and thanks for being a super guest on the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Maggie Fergusson. She's not on Twitter, but you can follow her work at 1843 Magazine, at The Spectator and The Tablet, and her biography of George Mackay Brown is published by John Murray.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Maggie?
Well, 2 things stood out to me. Firstly, the fortuitous nature of her first assignment on Mackay Brown that led to her book. I think all of us who have interviewed people have had those moments where the conversation isn't exactly going well and you're panicking about how on earth you're going to spin a piece out of it. Yet she managed not only to do that, but to cultivate a lasting and meaningful relationship with her subject, which was heartening to hear. And I guess secondly, and I think this is another thing that readers and particularly journalists will empathise with, I appreciated Maggie's honesty about pieces that hadn't really gone to plan. She acknowledged the fact that sometimes you don't know how to fix things and that there's not really any shame of that. Sometimes you're too close to things, you're too close to the detail and you can't really pull back and see the bigger picture. How about you?
I was fascinated with the whole Orkney thing because I've been there a few times and I find it a magical time. And Mackay Brown certainly has this kind of legendary reputation up there. So I loved hearing about all of that. I was also really interested to hear about how the Royal Society of Literature had changed and evolved from this kind of slightly fusty and old-fashioned organisation, which only had one typewriter, right? Didn't she say that?
But a great library.
But a great library. To how that has kind of moved, and I think that speaks to a lot of stuff that's been going on in the British literary world. So, all in all, a really great episode. Anyway, what have you been up to, Rachel? Otherwise,
I've been plodding along with my usual journalism, but actually I have my graduation from the NFTS this week, so that's the main thing that's on my agenda. I will be meeting lots of my course mates for the first time in person, given it was all done in lockdown. How about you? You've been juggling lots of pieces.
Yeah, I've just been grinding away really. Working this week on the text of a big piece for 1843 and refining another one. And then I just closed a big piece for the London Review of Books, which should be out by the time this goes out, which is exciting because I haven't read for them before. So yeah, busy as ever, really. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us via our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.